All right, welcome back to the hub, Marcus. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. It's been a while since we were in Africa together. Trying to avoid the sun and the dust, and uh, you know. But it's good. It's good to see you. Do you go by Mark or Marcus?
Marcus, yeah. You can call me Ashdown. I know that's probably a little bit more familiar for where we were, but yeah.
I know. I saw in your emails like Mark.Ashdown. I was like, wait a second, like maybe he goes by
Yeah.
Mark.
It's
Not Elder anymore. No.
it's Google. Google's trying to change my name.
Got it. Well, yeah, no, super excited you're coming on. I think this will be a little different. A lot of times we on the podcast are talking about economics or politics, but I think city planning, urban development is something that I think a lot of people are interested in, especially with Biden's big push for his new infrastructure bill. I think this will be something that our listeners will really, really enjoy. So first, why don't you tell us a little bit about like your background? How did you get into urban planning? Urban planning or urban development? Like, yeah.
Yeah, it was a kind of a developing situation as I was going into college. My experience in Africa, and really even maybe before, I spent a lifetime moving around. My dad's job was in the oil field, and so we moved around every few years. And so we lived in Europe. We lived a lot around the South, the Southwest, and so between that and as an adult moving around and going into college, and there was just this developing interest in place and people and kind of that dynamic between the two, where people are located and how they are located and how that kind of, impacts how they live their lives has always been very interesting to me. Buttle that with some very convincing professors in college that were able to get me off of whenever I went into college, I was on a theater acting track, and they just kind of diverted me to have a little bit more interest in people. And my engineer father also told me there's quite a few more jobs in the urban development sphere after college than there is in the acting sphere. So yeah, that's where it brings me to here. And whenever I went into grad school, I got a little bit more focused on transportation planning. That's a hot topic with the infrastructure plan that is being rolled out, as you mentioned, although not a lot of it is going to transportation. Quite a bit is needed though. But that got involved in a lot more discussions on design. And so in grad school, took quite a few engineering classes. And so that whole dynamic of, historically, these have been two different spheres. You had the people that design the buildings, and then the people that design the roads, and they'd have a driveway in between. And that was pretty much the limit of their communication. But with the innovations that are happening and the transitions that are happening in how we build cities, that conversation has to now become a lot more integrated, and the design has to become a lot more integrated. So there's a lot of interesting conversations going on.
So what do you mean by like, can you give us an example of like the integration happening or innovation happening in city planning? Because like me, the last time I've done city planning was playing SimCity, like back in the early 2000s, where it's like, you build roads and you try to zone out different developments and,
So, yeah, the issue with SimCity is it's one person making all the decisions, which unfortunately is not the case in the real world. It's a lot of people making different decisions, and they're very specific decisions. And so before, as I mentioned, there were people that were very specific to the buildings part of the infrastructure, and then people that were specific to the transportation side, because there's a lot of money in both. And so the professions have historically been very segregated. But there's a lot of innovations that have happened, and I could speak a lot better to the transportation side than the building side. But as you get into, even as 5 to 10 years ago, rideshare, which is a massive innovation shift in how we move, and our mobility scheme, and how we operate, getting from place to place around a city. That used to be something that was maybe only shared in like the biggest cities of the world, like Manhattan, London, that kind of taxi, drop and go type operation, but it became to where it was pretty much any city had a lot of this type of mobility strategy. And so, how the curb in front of a building was designed, it used to be that there was a curb there because maybe there was a sidewalk, but really the main point of access was the driveway into the parking lot, because everyone was driving from their garage to their parking lot to another parking lot and then end up back in their garage at the end of the day. And that was for decades how we operated. But now with Uber and Lyft, and we're seeing autonomous vehicles, and as our urban form also changes and we get a little bit more dense, transit becomes more effective. And so people are taking transit and walking and biking. And so it's just becoming a lot more complex. It's not just a single person. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the average vehicle occupancy on any road in the United States was 1.2. So basically everyone was driving by themselves. And so that dynamic is shifting and looks to continue to be shifting. And so as that dynamic does change, people are taking the train or a bus or an Uber to an area, not a specific building with a specific parking lot, but an area, and then walking to that area. It just changes how you design the space in front of the building. It doesn't need to have a 5-foot wheelchair accessible sidewalk because that's federally required and that's it. It now needs to have a space where an Uber car can pull up in front, drop off a person, then take off, almost like an airport, except not as chaotic. But so that's a lot of the conversations that are happening about how that integration now works and how people can access a site in more, alternative methods than just having a parking lot in the back.
That totally makes sense. Thanks for, that was super helpful. As you were talking, I had a couple of thoughts, like the micro transport, like scooters, electric scooters. I'm sure that also has impacted some of your planning and things like that.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if you saw this study, but Uber, you were talking about Manhattan. I get Manhattan's a little different than the town you're operating in. But they did a study where it was like, does Uber increase the traffic in downtown Manhattan versus like just having taxis? And the taxi union was like, no, it definitely does. And Uber's like, no, like it decreases traffic and whatnot. So I'm sure there's a lot of back and forth, like you said, with it's not just you making all these decisions on how the city's going to be planned, right? There's politics involved, there's other departments, there's people, and just I can imagine it's pretty complicated coming up, or it's pretty complicated coming up with the decision of like, hey, this is what we're gonna do, because you kind of have to get buy-in from everyone, really, right? Or is it just you guys saying like, hey, this is how we're gonna do it?
That's how a lot of cities would like to do it. They'd like to get the reins on how that all functions a little bit better. And some cities have, with micro transit, like you mentioned, scooters and bikes, that was just a wave, 3 years ago that no one was anticipating. And we went from nothing to every curb and corner having 15 scooters on it, and it just being a mess. And so there was a lot of cities that they're just like, oh, we need to pump the brakes a little bit and get some strategy involved to how this is overlaid and how it's operated. And that kind of goes into the same conversation as the Uber, Lyft versus taxi. It really gets down to how they're operating. The main congestion point, or added congestion point, I guess, would be the factor of deadheading. And so deadheading is when there's a Uber or taxi, some type of ride share that is not currently, they don't currently have a passenger. So they're driving around looking for and so there might be very little deadheading. Other locations, it might be as frequent as up to 30 to 40% of all cars in the area are driving around looking for work, and that's not new. That was actually the statistic that used to be for parking. So you go into any urban core area, and up to 30-40% of all cars driving around were looking for a parking spot, and not trying to get to a specific location, just looking to store their vehicle somewhere. And so I will say that in most of the larger cities, and more structured areas, for example, around airports, taxis have had a system where they don't just drive around. They go to a certain holding area and then wait for a call. And Uber and Lyft in some cities have started to not started. This is all pre-COVID, so this has been going for a while, but have done that as well, especially around airports, because you don't want them just driving around airports. So you'll see that a lot, where they'll have a holding area, and then once there's a call, then they move. But it all goes down to how they're operating, to going into the argument of who's worse on congestion or not. But it is an interesting dynamic that I think is even shifting more so, because that even that model itself and that argument is about 3 to 5 years old, and the transportation sphere is in a period of quite a bit of innovation, between microtransit, and that's going to level off. I think that's a great thing. Again, going back to alternative choices, the concept, there's a concept in the transportation industry called first last mile, which has been an issue, meaning whether you're driving or taking transit, when you get to a place, for example, a train stop, unless you're lucky enough to have where you're actually wanting to go right next to the train stop, you still have something left in your trip, which may be a mile or maybe a block or whatever it is. But driving is the same way, especially in urban areas where parking isn't right outside. If you think of a suburban strip mall, there's parking right outside. It's a whole nother discussion of how big of an issue that is, as far as connecting places. But the parking is almost seemingly accessible, but you get into a place where that's not the case. It's more dense, it's more urban. The parking is not accessible. So whenever you park your car, you still have to go somewhere. And so what that last bit of your trip is, or the first bit of your trip, if you're going back to your vehicle or back to your home, that first last mile concept has been a gap, honestly. And so things like microtransit, with scooters and bikes, and I've seen other different iterations of that, have really been good at addressing that gap. I can get to downtown in a train, but then I need to get to the convention center 4 blocks away, and I can jump on a scooter real quick to do that. And so I think it's filled a nice hole there, and hope for it to continue, just in a little bit more strategic function than what it was when it first rolled out.
Not scooters on every street line.
Yeah, it was a mess.
Yeah, I can believe it. Well, it definitely. I remember one of my professors or someone saying, like, trains, you got to go to a place you don't really want to go to another place where you don't really want to get dropped off on.
Right.
When he's talking about trains, but and so that issue is the same issue like we see in the e-commerce space as well, like with Amazon, like the last mile, right? They're really good at getting, or even Walmart, right? They're really good getting it to the actual store, but to getting it from a store to a person's home, like that last mile has always been tricky.
Right.
But I kind of want to switch gears a little bit, talking about infrastructure a little bit more. So in Europe, right, as you know, like trains are a big thing, right? If you want to go from like Paris to somewhere, like you take a train, you don't really drive. When we were living in Dallas, people had talked about, hey, there's this there's this idea of like trains from Dallas to Austin to Houston connecting the tri-state area. And having driven from Dallas to Austin, I was like, oh, this would have been sweet if we could have just hopped on a train. But I guess it's been a proposal for a long time. Like, why doesn't the U.S. develop those kind of trains, high-speed trains, to connect city to city?
I think that's changing. I think that, if we were to talk again in 10 years, the current trend is that transit and trains, that is much more part of the mobility mix, going forward than it has been. the reason why it hasn't been is because of the urban form. Again, going back to how transportation folks have their face down and they're looking at the roads, they're looking at the highways and trainways and just kind of focus on the alignment between the cities and such. But how America, especially non-East Coast America, formed mostly around the automobile. And so our urban form isn't great for transit, whereas Europe, a lot of Europe was developed pre-automobile, or at least their urban cores are, or their main cities are, and so they can operate a little bit closer, going exactly to the first last mile concept. Once you get off at a train station or a bus stop, what can you access in a reasonable distance? The industry standard is, if it's not within about a 10 to 15 minute walking distance, it's not really seen as accessible from a train or bus stop. And so you can get to a lot more places in Europe, or a lot of places on the East Coast, Northeast coast, within a 10, 15 minute walk than you can in Dallas. In Dallas, you might be able to get to, a place in 10 to 15 minute walk. And so that is changing, because a big shift that we've seen in the urban side over the last 10 years, and again, this is pre-COVID, so this will be interesting if it continues to go this way, was a return to the cities. A lot of downtowns were starting to grow really well. I live outside of Dallas, but I would commute every day into downtown Dallas, and the amount of investment that was going back into downtowns was really, really high, and it was showing a lot of growth. Now, COVID was a wicked curveball that we have not yet not been able to see what kind of impact that has. So far, the impact is not great because of virtual working, and a lot of companies are pushing to have that kind of remote flexibility going forward. That doesn't say great things for the future of our downtowns, especially the downtowns that don't have a high amount of cultural center. If you think of New York, sure, it's a business hub, but it's also a cultural hub. People live in the city to be close to each other. A lot of cities in the West and Southwest that was the next step. They were getting the business side set up, but they were still working on getting the cultural glue together, where people were wanting to live in downtown Dallas, Fort Worth, Denver, to live in downtown Dallas, Fort Worth, Denver type thing, and not just because that was where their job was located. And so it's an interesting shift. But going back to your question about trains and their availability, the one that you mentioned going down, not to Austin but to Houston, that one is for all intents and purposes moving forward. That high-speed connection from Dallas to Houston, they've got a longer vision of connecting the Texas Triangle, so Dallas to Houston, and then Dallas over to Fort Worth, and then Fort Worth down through Austin and San Antonio, and even on to Monterrey, Mexico. And so that's a little longer vision, but the Dallas to Houston one is looking like it may overtake California's one that's been in the news plenty, as one of the first high-speed running trains that are in the U.S. But it's something that shows pre-COVID to have been on the track for a lot more attention, because again, the cities were starting to get developed a lot more, and people were wanting to locate near a train station. I will say that, going back to the original point, prior to that, a train station was just as accessible as an airport. There were not very many people around, and so you still had to drive. For example, if there was a train from Dallas to Houston, I would have to commute down to downtown Dallas, where the high-speed train station would be, to get to it, to then go back south, because I live south of Dallas, go back south to go to Houston. And once I got to Houston, I'd have to rent a car or something to then get to where my parents live in Houston. So it'd be great. However, it's almost, in mobility ways, it's almost as accessible as jumping on a plane. So there's a lot more investment needed to really make that competitive with me being able to drive down to Houston, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I look at it when I was living in Salt Lake, but going to school in Provo, it's like, cool, I can go to same exact concept. It's like, it's a little tougher, being on a train's great. Don't have to worry about traffic or driving. But once I get off the train, I got to still get to school, and that's a mile.
To get somewhere.
Yeah.
Right.
How am I going to do that? So, but I would bike because I'm a little bit of a biker, but that's okay.
Hey.
It's a little different biking a mile versus like 3 or 4 miles in the Texas heat during the middle of summer.
or 30 miles because of our Texas cities are ginormous. And so, yeah.
So, super helpful. I think a lot of us like are impacted by these decisions, but we just don't know a lot about it. So this has been super helpful to like educate us and like get us familiar with like thinking of like, oh, okay, like these are the issues like Marcus face or Ashdown faces, like when they're doing this stuff. But you mentioned investing, and this is kind of like the final like piece or portion that I want to spend some time talking about. So, and this will be a little bit of politics. So if you don't want to talk about it, I totally understand. But there's a sense of like, when you look at China, they're able to build roads, infrastructure, trains like really quick, right? Like massive state investment in infrastructure. Looking at Biden, it kind of seems like he's looking at the China model and saying like, hey, government needs to drive a little bit more growth. We need to invest public dollars into public works infrastructure. And, we did that in the 50s with the interstate, right? We've had a history of doing this in certain periods. And so the big push is now like, okay, hey, we need to like revitalize our nation's infrastructure. It's aging. We need to do it. And so he's come out with I think the last I saw was like a $2 trillion plan to reinvest in America, build back better. You being the expert, what's your sense? Is it really needed? Like, are the roads and bridges really that bad and we do need some, repair? Or is it more of just like a handout for like, unions? Because I mean, like you said, there's a lot of money in this. And, when I drive by sometimes working on road, people working on road construction, it's like 20 people fixing like a little hole, but there's like, and it pays really well. Like, union jobs. It's like, so is this like just like a money, just throwing money to people, or is there like a real need for the infrastructure?
It's probably both. It's definitely a need. I'll speak from what I can actually speak to, which is the infrastructure side. The American Society of Civil Engineers, every 4 years they do an infrastructure report card, and 2021 is the next year, and so, or I believe it's 2020. Anyways, it just within the last few weeks they came out with their updated report card, and overall America's infrastructure was graded at I believe it was a D. I'd have to go back and look, but it was around a D, which actually is just a little bit better than it was 4 years before that. So it's not trending the wrong direction, but it's not in a place that is we should be braggadocious about or anything. So it definitely needs investment. Now, whether this package is really getting it to the places where it needs to be, I would have to do a lot more research into it than I have to talk to that. And so I don't know if it's getting to the right hands. But it's definitely needed. This is something that has been needed for a long time. So the last time that the gas tax, which is the primary funding source of federal funding, which is the primary source of transportation and major infrastructure funding. However, quick caveat to that's Dallas to Houston high-speed rail project is actually all privately funded. There's no federal dollars, which is really the reason why it's advancing and it's getting somewhere. But
the California one's been around forever. I feel like
yeah,
I feel like it wants more government funding. So, anyways,
yeah. Yeah, and that's a larger discussion of alternative funding, because up to within the last 5 to 10 years, or maybe even a little bit beforehand, federal funding and maybe a little state and county match, but almost primarily federal funding has really been the only source of transportation funding or transit funding, even. And so more alternative methods of getting dollars into a project, whether it's private funding or whether it's a partnership, where it's a public-private partnership, a P3 type deal. Those have become a little bit more prevalent. Those are different things that have helped to accelerate the progression of a project. I will say, though, that the China versus American model is a little bit more complicated on its face, because one, I don't know everything about the Chinese model, but I do know that there are a lot more steps of review than both there is within the Chinese system and than there was within our U.S. system in the 1950s. Whenever you mentioned the U.S. interstate highway big rollout, at that point it was really, if the engineers that just and politicians always would just get together and just put a line on a map, and if that line went straight through the downtown of a city, then that's where the highway was going, the interstate was going, and has created decades of headache from urban relationships since then. Dallas, since we continue to use that as a reference city, is one where the interstate goes right through the city. And it's interesting, and one of the reasons why I really enjoy talking about transportation, because that is supposed to be this vein of the country, just this connection to everywhere else in the country. And so it's this great mobility and access kind of symbol, the interstate. And yet when it does that and it goes right through a city, and this is not just Dallas, this is Atlanta, this is Denver, this is Houston, so many different locations where they went right through the middle of the city, it's a wall. And and you can see this, you pull up Google Maps and look at any aerial on the one side of that wall, pick a side, you'll see one side is big urban core and the other side is just this massive drop off in development. Because even though there's bridges that go across or tunnels that go underneath, it's this huge development wall that kind of blocks off one half or part of the city. And just over the decades, we've developed over that. And the Dallas example is another good one, because Dallas is one of the first ones to kind of address that. So there's a park called Clyde Warren Park. The company I work for, Jacobs, actually, it was the one who designed it, and we're designing currently the extension for it. So this is a recessed section of the interstate, which means that it's below ground. And so the street level are bridges that go over the top of it. So it was just this big valley in the middle of the city. And the downtown Dallas was on one side, and then on the other side you had uptown, but it was a massive drop off in development on the other side, like I mentioned. And so what we designed was basically we turned that big valley into a tunnel, and then we put a deck park over the top of it. And this is small. I mean, this is probably 8 lanes of traffic. So it's not like tiny, but it's not a huge park, but it covers the top of the highway. And there's still bridges that go over the cross. Actually, it's the same streets. There's a couple streets that were disconnected, but same streets that go across. So the vehicle access from one side to the other hasn't changed. It's just the pedestrian access and bicycle. Sorry, you're a cyclist. So the cyclist access has changed quite a bit, and it's a lot more appealing because it's a park. There's been, I can't remember off the top of my head, billions of dollars of real estate development around that park. And it is the #1 tourist attraction in the DFW area. Not Cowboy Stadium, not downtown Fort Worth stockyards. Clyde Warren Park is, because it's become this kind of new cultural center. Like I said, there was a lot of efforts in trying to get a new cultural center into these downtowns, and it's spawned lots of development on the other side, which had been previously historically underdeveloped because of this system. But anyways, going back to your original statement, your question, the way that those interstates were built was just based on politics and logic. And there was no talk about what the impact was going to be to the communities. what the impact was going to be to the design of the city of itself, how it functions. And so now there's a lot more discussion into the environmental impacts, into the social impacts of a road, because they are major. They can effectively be a wall to a community. You can get into how the Atlanta interstate was developed, how it doesn't go right through the middle of the downtown. It comes, look on a map, it's very interesting. The interstate comes right up to downtown, and then it makes this curve right around it. Well, it just so happens to curve right between the downtown and the historically Black neighborhoods, basically becoming a wall to those neighborhoods from the downtown area. And so there's a long conversation behind that. And so to mitigate for those impacts, there's a lot of now checks and balances within the design and development sequence for that. Currently, also in Atlanta, I'm doing a visual impact assessment of these express lanes that they're putting on the loop that goes around Atlanta, along the north side of Atlanta. And, the design of the roadway is finished, really. I mean, mostly, but we'll still probably be doing this for another 1.5 to 2 years because it's going to be elevated. And so all these communities that are along this road, they used to be able to look over the current interstate that's there, 285, and see trees or the Chattahoochee River or whatever it may be. Now they're going to see a big roadway going over the top. So there's going to be a big visual impact to what they're going to be looking at now. And so how we mitigate for that is the current conversation. And so it's kind of a balance. You need the roads, you need the design, we need the investment, but how we put them in is going to have impacts to our communities for decades and decades into the future. And so there's got to be a little bit more conversation in that. So I would say that the amount of investment needs to increase, but there's also some good checks and things that we've learned since the 1950s. And going back to the funding part of that the equation, the gas tax hasn't changed since I think the 80s, if I remember correctly. It hasn't been elevated, which inflation alone has made the purchasing power of that gas tax a lot less. But when you take into account that not only are our cars becoming more, there's a lot of more alternative choice in our cars. We can do electric vehicles, which don't use gas. And so basically they're using the roads for free. But all cars have become more fuel efficient. And so that also makes the purchasing power. So yeah, there has needed to be a change in how we fund our roads for a long time. I saw Pete Buttigieg got a lot of flack for talking about a vehicle miles traveled tax, which I haven't seen exactly how he worded it. So I don't know if he just didn't explain it correctly, but it's kind of unfortunate because that has been in the transportation conversation for as long as I've been in the transportation industry, about how we really need to fund transportation in a different way and funding it based on usage. I mean, that's how many things are done. It makes a lot of sense. And also, this is not new. I mean, you're in Utah. Utah already has a pilot program for people who pay based on use instead of based on gas. I mean, it used to be whenever all our vehicles were gas, that it was kind of based on use, but that's not the case anymore. And so it needs to change, and express lanes that are also based on use, toll lanes, or just a kind of an annual fee that's based on how many miles you traveled on the roads that were paid for by that tax. It needs to change a little bit, or else we're going to just continue digging ourselves in the hole of not being able to fund these projects.
Interesting. So it sounds like funding's really an issue. Like funding hasn't been innovative as transportation in general has changed,
right,
and developed over the years.
Right.
Okay. Well, from the economist libertarian side of me, like two thoughts is like, well, that's what happens when government gets involved with like, you find these unintended consequences, or maybe they were intended, think a little darker when you think Atlanta and like maybe purposely trying to segregate people. But and then the economist is like, yeah, you pay for what you use. Like, I mean, we do that for everything, really. I mean, if you value being on the road and be able to drive, like you should pay for it. But it definitely strikes to like, wait, why do I have to pay to use a road? You know, this definitely seems a little interesting, I guess.
Right.
Huh. Well, super helpful, super informative. Much appreciated. Kind of wrapping up here. Last question for you. So, and I think we talked a little bit about with electric vehicles. When I think transportation, right? One guy comes to mind, Elon Musk, right? I mean, this guy has his own spaceship, his own space company, right? He basically electric vehicles. I mean, they were always kind of like, oh yeah, you can buy like a Chevy Volt or, you know, but like no one like, you know, or a Prius, but like those were always like hybrids and like no one really was. But now it's like Tesla's like, and all these other, you know, historical car companies are like trying to rush into electric vehicles. He also has the Boring Company because he hates traffic in LA, and he's like, let's just dig a tunnel and, you know, so I can get from point A to point B. Like, I mean, he seems to be like your guy, you know, like if you were, I don't know, maybe the transportation industry doesn't idolize him, but for me, I'm like, hey, this guy is like, he's totally reinventing the game. Like, what's your thoughts on Elon Musk? Like, what's like, you know, kind of all his different transportation initiatives? Just like give from someone who's an expert in the industry, like, what's your view of someone like Elon Musk coming in and being like, we're gonna just build a tunnel, you know, and have cars go through there.
Elon Musk, never heard of him. No idea who this guy is. Yeah. No, he is, yeah, he absolutely is a visionary. And I certainly hope that at least some of his visions do, whether it be in space or Mars or tunnels or whatever it may be. I hope that a lot of them come to fruition. Because you know, innovation is always the key. And I think that is the biggest plus from what he's been doing through a lot of these different initiatives is just getting people to think in a non-traditional sense, like that. You made that comment just a minute ago of why am I needing to pay to be on the roads? Because, you know, that has been how we've grown up, you know, and the generation before us grown up. I mean, that is just how we have operated. Is the road is there. I mean, you just drive on it and you just go. But it's never been that simple. I mean, to the person who isn't involved in the conversation, it is very simple, but it's never been that simple because that money has to come from somewhere. I mean, the road has to be built by someone, and maybe it's not the government, you know, like that railway from Dallas to Houston, that's all privately funded, you know, and so maybe that is the future of transportation, is it becomes a lot more privatized than it has been. That would be a very larger discussion, but you know, I think that my reaction to Elon Musk is that is key, is being able to look at things, to address the current issues. I will say that I'm skeptical about the Boring Company and the tunnel idea because, you know,
when they
will
started
it?
Flamethrowers, I was like, okay, how much
Yeah.
is this?
I have no comment on the flamethrower. That's far outside my expertise. But you know, the tunnels. It sounds great. It's exactly what the interstate system was supposed to do. It was supposed to cut down on region to region traffic. And what did we do? We started to build our cities on the interstate, and now a lot of interstate use is not going from state to state. It's going from, like, I use the interstate to go into work. And when I live in the region, and that's that's the story of every region. And you know, for decades, the problem or the solution to, our interstates are getting clogged in the AM and PM rush hours, let's add a lane and we'll increase capacity, we'll be good to go. Well, that's going back to that discussion of transportation and urban form being always integrated, and the conversations of how they're developed needing to be more integrated, because whenever we added the lane and we added more capacity, we said to the housing developers, now you can go to what used to be agricultural land and you can build a big subdivision and neighborhood and community, and they can get into downtown super fast because there's capacity for them to go 70 miles an hour into the urban core. And so they would build a bunch of houses and the capacity would get sucked up and we would be under capacity again. So we would have to build another lane and then we'd build another suburb and so the sprawl happened. And so being that is been how we have operated since the interstate system has come in, and even before the interstate system with every transportation innovation, with going to streetcars and then going to trains, light rail, every time we've added the ability to go outward, it's been this expansionist kind of movement. And so when we talk about tunnels, it sounds great. However, how long is it until we've got this 50-tiered tunnel system? Because at least in the current model, it's just a single vehicle tube, and they're all crisscrossing going different directions. I mean, that seems like it's the underground railroad underneath Manhattan, the subway system, out of control. If it was strategically done to where it was going from, it would have to operate like a train, right? It's single point to single point. The convention center to a regional parking lot or something like that, that kind of system. But if it's just for general mass use, I'm skeptical because it sounds exactly like the theory behind the interstate system and the state highway system, even below that. And we just have this tendency to just continue to just keep on building on top of that, and it becomes kind of a chaos very quickly. But with autonomous vehicles and aerial vehicles as well, Dallas is currently building an aerial station and was supposed to be by this year. I think COVID will push it back a year or two, but they're going to start operating aerial taxis from where you were at, North Dallas, down to downtown Dallas, over to DFW Airport, and start that. And that's going to be one of the first in the world operating in that regard. And so there again, I think the solution going forward is really choice. Maybe there are some tunnels. I think it would be, the tunneling system is a whole different conversation. I would feel uncomfortable being underground in California with all the seismic activity, but I'm also not from California, so maybe people are a lot more comfortable out there. Tunneling in Texas would be a whole nother brand of issues because of the bedrock that we're on top. There's a reason why no one has basements here. It's a little difficult, but I think that the real solution is the choice, that there's funding choice, that there's mode choice. You can get from one section of the city either by jumping on a train, yes, jumping in a car, or jumping in an aerial drone and being able to go that way. It's all going to come down to how projects are funded, who's at the levers, and how the strategy is rolled out. Autonomous vehicles could be just the next sprawl machine. If they're built like a vehicle is my new bedroom, and I can live 3 hours away from downtown, wake up at 3 a.m, go back to sleep in my car, and wake up in at my office, I could live far away. So there's got to be a strategy around it so that we continue to kind of build and invest in the right location, or else it'll just be kind of more of the same going forward.
Totally makes sense. It's interesting to see in the future of transportation. It doesn't seem like, I guess it doesn't seem super complicated, but there's tons of knockoff implications, and there really is a lot going into it, I feel like. And I appreciate you sharing your thoughts here. I remember there was a textbook and they talked about the the global shipping containers, the box that that was one of the major innovations of the 20th centuries. And I was like, what? Why? And it's it totally standardized shipping
right
across the world. Whether you're China, Taiwan, India, doesn't matter. Those boxes are ubiquitous. Everyone uses them, and it's totally changed, the shipping industry. And I feel with what you were saying, it gave us some insight of how autonomous vehicles, how that's going to impact, or building the freeway, how it's going to impact cities and people, and just the urban development in general. So
absolutely.
Thanks for coming on. Appreciate you sharing some thoughts. I guess any other last thoughts you'd want to say before we wrap up here?
Sure. It's kind of going off that comment. It's really the reason why I've really enjoyed being in the career that I'm in, because it's something that's in our everyday lives. Like, unless you live in a home and you're not going anywhere, and by home I mean like senior facility. You're moving every day to go work, to go eat, to go play. I mean, whatever it is, and there's so much more behind that, and so it's how we access things, and it really is kind of like SimCity. It's way more complicated than SimCity, obviously everything is, but it is like SimCity, where you can put this strategy in place and it can enable a massive amount of opportunity and development and growth. And if you don't do it correctly, if your projections are off or your design is off, you can do the opposite. You can build a wall around a community or through a community that segregates people. You can design a road so that it encourages the speed limit because of either the curvature of the road or the lights are synchronized. And so if you're going the speed limit, you'll hit every green light. And if you're speeding, you'll hit every red light and it'll slow you down. Or you can design it incorrectly, where you create congestion because they're not synchronized. When I was timing signals in Atlanta in grad school, I mean, we were getting it to the second. Signals had to be timed to the second to be able to get that sync, because over time, if it's off by a second or two, it just continues to compound the issue and you create congestion. So, but that's just from the access point of view. There's also a huge safety issue. You can create a lot of safety, and we've all been on roads where we take a turn or something like that, and which is like, why in the world was that designed that way? Like, I just feel like I almost died just trying to drive this road or something. And it's we lived in Africa together, and I certainly saw several people killed on the roads. I wouldn't be surprised if you did as well. It internationally, outside of heart disease and cancer, as far as things that we do that kill people, it's always at the top. Whether it was drunk driving or distracted driving, it's always at the top of activities that kill people, the most people around the world. And so there's major implications, not only from an opportunity sake, but just from a quality of life and state of life sake, in doing it well. And so that's really what has kept me interested and has made a very interesting career so far. I appreciate you having me on. This is a really cool conversation.
Yeah, well, again, thanks to you for taking some time. And then for our listeners, anything transportation, Marcus is your guy. And if you want to see what the future of travel looks like, this is it. No, and I really do appreciate the perspective, especially with Biden's infrastructure plan being pushed out. I feel like this was super timely. So thanks again, and our listeners, hope you enjoyed. So thanks, Marcus. We'll see you around.
Thank you, man. Take care.
I'll see you.